Meghan Markle, a name most of us have heard constantly since the Duke and Duchess stepped down from their roles as senior members of the royal family, and who then later moved to the US. Well, it's been a while since the couple launched their latest endeavor, a multi-year, multi-million-dollar podcast deal signed with Spotify in late 2020. The result? Archetypes by Meghan Markle. How has the podcast fared in the highly saturated industry? Is Archetypes living up to everything it claimed to be? Let's take a deeper look. Aside from the news of their infamously dubbed Megxit, the royals have continued on living seemingly quiet lives, even dabbling in some new business opportunities, the latest of which is the long-anticipated podcast. So, what is Archetypes? The official synopsis from Spotify is a podcast where we investigate, dissect, and subvert the labels that try to hold women back. Has the podcast episodes thus far lived up to its claims? Well, the short answer is yes, but also no. Despite the podcast being proclaimed by Spotify as a major hit, most listeners and critics have a multitude of opinions that say otherwise. Before we can continue on, we need to talk about a typical episode within the podcast. In every episode, she talks about a story in her life, most often from her childhood or teenage years. Her stories are almost always seen as far-fetched or heavily exaggerated. This isn't unusual though. Her over-narration has no limits, which really makes you question her authenticity above anything really. A key element in her episodes is that Meghan chooses a word to decode, an example of which are ambition and diva. She does this through interviews with her celebrity friends or acquaintances. Some notable guests include Mariah Carey, Paris Hilton, Deepika Padukone, and her longtime BFF Serena Williams. For a podcast that has managed to dethrone Joe Rogan's The Joe Rogan Experience, the interviewer Meghan Markle sure does know how to keep the spotlight on herself and subsequently undermines interviewees. Yes, the podcast does talk about experiences from a diverse group of prominent women, but sharing experience is one thing, and breaking the stereotype is another. The execution is quite frankly disappointing. The whole purpose of the podcast is to break down the different stereotypes and labels that have defined women for as long as we can remember, so it's heartbreaking to see a platform and audience as large as hers being turned into nothing more than an overpriced self-promotion. Adding insult to injury, she handles her podcast in a way where she ends up using the same stereotypes to aid her breaking down other stereotypes. She is using her millions of impressionable listeners to spread her narrow views and ideologies. But at the end of the day, all that should matter is the audience's feedback. Most of the audience has similar opinions. One user wrote, "This podcast is full of stereotypical presentations of the guests. Simply put, misinformed and silly. The creator doesn't even know the meaning of the word archetype or how it differs from stereotype. Yikes." Another critic wrote, "As predictably, it was a love fest. However genuine in this case, this tactic has its upsides and its downsides. An upside is that it does foster intimacy, or at least the familiarity resembling it. One downside was that over the course of the hour, not a lot of information or insight was delivered. The audience, for the most part, are on two opposite sides of the spectrum, ending by them either liking the podcast or being left irked by the false hope promised." The bottom line here is that Meghan Markle's podcast Archetypes is nothing more than hour-long episodes filled to the brim with misinformation, twisted facts, and propaganda, especially becoming a bias herself. She's doing a terrible job representing and tearing down generational stereotypes, something she claims is what she wants to make right. What do you think? Is Meghan Markle making an actual impact, doing right by her podcast, or is she just misusing her platform for an easy cash grab? Let me know in the comments below about your thoughts in the matter.